So, think about a piece of history that you're absolutely 100% sure is settled fact. Well, in this explainer, we are going to completely rewrite one of those facts. We're diving into a story of just immense scientific genius, an agonizing century-long wait, and an incredible, tiny artifact that's just sitting quietly in a museum right now. Get ready, because we're about to totally shift your perspective on the origin of the modern world.
If I ask you right now, who really invented the airplane? I mean, almost everyone immediately pictures the Wright brothers, right? Wheeling their machine out onto those windy dunes of Kitty Hawk back in 1903. And look, it's a great story, but what if I told you that the actual architectural blueprint for literally every airplane in the sky today wasn't invented in 1903? What if it was actually invented a full 104 years earlier, and not by bicycle mechanics, but by a teenager working in a hexagonal workshop in North Yorkshire? Yeah. Let's completely rethink everything we know about the origins of human flight.
What's truly mind-blowing here is that the literal founding document of human flight is right in front of us. Back in 1799, a young English baronet named Sir George Cayley took a piece of silver, literally the size of a coin, and working by candlelight, he just engraved his revolutionary ideas right onto it. On one side, he etched a flying machine. It had a fixed wing, a boat-shaped hull, a cross-shaped tail, and these little paddles for propulsion. On the flip side, he engraved a complete diagram of aerodynamic forces. This is before petrol engines, before aluminum, before any working aircraft even existed. Cayley basically pressed the entire architectural configuration of the modern airplane into a little coin he could keep in his pocket. Today, it just sits in the Science Museum in London, and people just walk right by it, completely ignoring it.
To really understand why this tiny little disc is such a work of absolute genius, we kind of have to understand the trap that it completely paralyzed human flight for, well, about 700 years. I like to call it the biological trap. For centuries, brilliant minds, we're talking everyone from Leonardo da Vinci to those early tower-jumping monks, they all falsely believed that to fly like a bird, you had to build like a bird, meaning you had to flap, because a bird's wing was the only working flying machine anyone had ever actually seen, right? So it was the only thing anyone tried to copy. Cayley was the very first person to step back and realize that birds were actually leading us down a massive evolutionary dead end.
When you look at history, it's really filled with the kind of tragic comedy of this mistake. In the 11th century, Aylmer of Malmesbury literally jumped from his abbey tower wearing a feathered cloak, broke both of his legs. Da Vinci filled notebook after notebook dissecting bats and drawing these crazy flapping ornithopters that never had a chance of flying. Why? Well, it just comes down to simple math. When you scale a body up, its mass increases by the cube of its size. But the wing area, that only increases by the square. And worse than that, muscle power just doesn't scale to match it. There is a hard physical ceiling of about 15 kilograms, beyond which sustained flapping flight is just mathematically impossible. Birds were basically lying by example. Flapping wasn't some universal secret to flight, it was just a one-off biological accident for very, very small animals.
Okay, so let's dive into the counterintuitive leap that changed literally everything. Cayley realized that a bird is actually doing three things all at once with its wing. It generates lift by holding a curve to the wind, thrust by beating backward, and control by twisting. Nature basically took all these functions and fused them into one super complex organ. Cayley's true genius was systems engineering. He decomposed flight. He looked at it and pulled those three functions apart. He realized, hey, you could build a fixed wing just for lift, a totally separate mechanism just for thrust, and a separate tail just for control. He took one impossible problem and turned it into three independent, totally solvable problems.
This brilliant illustration really drives the point home perfectly. Notice how the bird's wing over on the left is this fully integrated system. It's doing everything at once. Now look over at the aircraft models on the right. By separating lift, thrust, and control, the airplane suddenly becomes a modular system. And once you separate the functions, well, you can start improving them independently. You don't have to flap the wings to move forward anymore, you can just attach a propeller. This is the exact conceptual move that every great engineer makes, and Cayley made it a full century before the Wright brothers even got to the beach.
Let's see how this all builds into the pure physics of flight. Remember the reverse side of that silver coin from 1799? Cayley literally drew the exact diagram that is still sitting in every single high school physics textbook today. No joke. He defined the four forces of flight: weight pulling the aircraft down, lift pushing it up, thrust propelling it forward, and drag holding it back. It is just so incredibly elegant. The idea is simple. If you can build a machine where lift equals weight and thrust overcomes drag, it will fly.
And he actually summarized this entire revelation into a single, beautiful sentence in an 1809 paper. He wrote that the whole problem of flight is, quote, to make a surface support a given weight by the application of power to the resistance of air. That sentence is so spare, so profound and so perfectly accurate that you could literally carve it into the stone of an aerospace engineering building today. He didn't just get the answer right, he got the question right.
But getting an aircraft off the ground is really only half the battle. Stopping it from immediately tumbling back down to Earth is another thing entirely. Cayley used to watch lapwings, these small birds with wedge-shaped tails tumbling and then recovering in the air above his Yorkshire estate. He noticed that they use their tails to steer. So what does he do? He invents the cruciform tail for his gliders. It's a cross-shaped tail. He put a horizontal surface, the elevator, to control pitch, which is nose up and down, and a vertical surface, the rudder, to control yaw, which is nose left and right. Set them together, and it makes a cross. And guess what? Every airplane from a folded paper dart to a massive Boeing 747 still uses this exact same steering blueprint today.
So the really crucial point here is that Cayley had to make his early models fly completely by themselves. He didn't have a human pilot, he didn't have actuators, and he definitely didn't have computers to correct the aircraft if a sudden gust of wind tipped it over. So he invented inherent stability using something called dihedral. Basically, he gave the wings a slight upward V-shape angle. Think about it. If a gust rolls the aircraft to the right, the lower wing suddenly catches more air directly, generates more lift, and passively pushes the plane right back to level flight. He engineered an aircraft that actively wanted to fly straight and level. Okay, so by 1810, Cayley had entirely solved the physics and aerodynamics of flight. He had built models that flew beautifully. And yet, this is where the story turns into a real tragedy of timing. He hits a massive, totally insurmountable wall. To achieve powered flight, he obviously needed an engine. But he quickly calculated that the only mature engine of his day, the steam engine, was just too heavy by a massive order of magnitude. It weighed hundreds of kilograms per horsepower. If you wanted to lift an aircraft, the engine alone would weigh over a ton.
Cayley desperately needed a prime mover with a way better power-to-weight ratio. But none existed. So, incredibly, he spent years trying to just invent one himself. He built hot air engines, which he actually helped pioneer, but they were just too feeble. Get this, he even built wildly dangerous gunpowder engines. Yeah, it was an early internal combustion device that fired small explosions of gunpowder to drive a piston. It was incredibly clever, but hopelessly unreliable. Cayley had fully invented the airplane, but the technology to actually power it was literally decades away from existing.
When you look at the timeline of these events, it just perfectly captures the unbelievable patience of this man. He has his massive breakthrough in 1799, he flies the very first stable fixed-wing glider in 1804. By 1810, he publishes his unified theory and hits that engine wall. And then, he just waits. He waits over 40 years. He grows old, his wife passes away, and finally, realizing that a suitable engine is just not going to be invented in his lifetime, the 79-year-old baronet decides he absolutely must at least see his aircraft carry a full-grown man as a glider before he dies, which leads us to the crazy events of 1853.
So, in the summer of 1853, out on a Yorkshire hillside called Bromptondale, Cayley assembled this massive glider that he called the Governable Parachute. It had a huge linen wing, a cruciform tail, and this wooden boat-shaped basket slung underneath. But Cayley was 79, he was too old to fly it himself, so he turned to his coachman, John Appleby, who, by the way, was also 79. Just imagine this conversation. Appleby was hired to tend horses and drive carriages, right? Not to participate in experimental aerodynamics? Yet somehow, the elderly baronet convinced his elderly coachman to climb into this wooden basket. Farmhands literally pulled the glider down the hill with a rope. It caught the wind, and John Appleby flew across the valley for about 5 to 10 seconds. He became the very first adult human in history to be lifted into the air by a heavier-than-air machine. He crashed relatively safely, thankfully. And family legend insists that Appleby climbed out of the wreckage, walked right up to his employer, raised his hat, and said, "Please, Sir George, I wish to give notice. I was hired to drive, not to fly." Whether he said exactly those words or not, it just perfectly captures the collision of a completely ordinary worker with a completely impossible future.
The Wright brothers wouldn't fly a Kitty Hawk for another 50 years. I mean, they hadn't even been born yet when Cayley's coachman took to the sky. Cayley's story is such a profound reminder of how innovation actually works. It isn't always the sudden flash of lightning that changes the world overnight. Sometimes, the complete blueprint is sitting right there, scratched onto a tiny silver coin, waiting an entire century for the rest of technology to catch up. Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating question to end on. If the airplane was invented 100 years before it could be practically built, what impossible future has already been solved, sitting quietly in an ignored workshop right now, just waiting for the right battery or engine to bring it to life? Keep learning, keep questioning, and thanks for joining me in this explainer.